Hi, everyone. This is Sam Silverman, Managing Partner, EB5 Affiliate Network. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend a few minutes with us to talk about source of funds best practices for Mexican nationals. Today, we're going to be joined by Julian Montero, a good friend and colleague, well-known EB5 and experienced EB5 immigration attorney in the space with extensive dealings with Mexican EB5 investors. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, and we're going to have a YouTube video posted of the recording of the webinar in a few days. So if you need to reference in the future, it'll be on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in getting a PDF copy of the slides following the presentation today, please reach out to us. The email's on the center of the screen, info@eb5an.com, and we can share a copy of the presentation. During the presentation, if there are any questions that come up, please use the chat box on your screen to submit any questions, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we can at the end of the webinar today. So first, to get started, a quick outline of what we're going to cover in the webinar today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about our guest speaker and EB5 affiliate network, or EB5AN for short. We'll talk about what exactly is source of funds, how does it fit in terms of the EB5 investment context. We'll talk about some of the most common sources of funds that investors draw capital from to make EB5 investments. And we'll talk about some of the pitfalls and issues that EB5 investors face when documenting their sources of capital for their investment. Then we'll talk specifically about best practices for Mexican nationals and what types of documents are really country specific that investors with assets in Mexico are going to want to take note of. And then we'll wrap up at the end, and we'll cover question and answers, and we'll also chat a little bit about 2 EB5 projects that are currently available as well. So first, before we jump in, for those looking to determine if a project does qualify as a targeted employment area, meaning that the minimum investment is the lower 900,000 amount instead of the 1.8 million, please check out our targeted employment area map. It's completely free, available at eb5an.com. You can type in any address in the US or any of the US territories, and it'll immediately tell you if a site does qualify and allow you to generate a free qualification report as well. Then additionally, for more information about the EB5 visa program and investment process overall, you can reference our EB5 Guidebook, available in hard copy on Amazon, or if you want a digital copy at eb5guidebook.com, completely free as well. Okay, so we'll start with a little bit about EB5 Affiliate Network and our guest speaker. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm Sam Silverman, one of the managing partners at EB5 Affiliate Network, and joined today by my partner, Mike Schoenfeld, who I'll let introduce himself as well.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for the webinar. As Sam mentioned, I'm Mike Schoenfeld. My background's on the screen. Prior to founding EB5 about 8 years ago, I was working in private equity at AEA and at the Boston Consulting Group before that, which is where I met Sam. As you can see, all three of us came from more of an institutional background, working at some of the largest financial institution, legal firms and consulting firms, and we try to bring that experience to the EB5 industry.
A little bit about EB5 Affiliate Network as a company. We're a national regional center operator and fund manager. Overall, across all of our regional centers, we have more than 1,800 EB5 investors from more than 60 countries, and we've been in the EB5 space since 2013. Our regional centers cover about half of the continental United States, and all the regional centers are all owned directly by our parent company, EB5 Affiliate Network. One of the most things that we're most proud of as a company is that investors from a wide variety of backgrounds all around the world have consistently found value in our approach to EB5 investment. And this is just a short overview map of where some of our investors are from. And now I'll let our guest speaker, Julian Montero, step in and introduce himself and share a little bit about his experience practicing law in the EB5 space and about his experience specifically with Mexican nationals seeking to pursue EB5.
Thank you very much, Sam and Mike. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and thank you for those that are attending. I've been practicing for about 25 years, and my background really comes from a general corporate background. I actually started off as a corporate tax lawyer in Boston, and realized that my desire to be active with Latin America was probably better suited for other markets, and moved to Miami in the end of '96. Since then, I've been quite active with all things LATAM, and fairly active with Mexican investors in the EB5 space. So it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Julian, do you want to spend a few minutes just giving some background on Saul?
Sure, thank you, Sam. So Saul Ewing is a full service firm. We are in 17 cities across the US, predominantly focused in the Northeast, Midwest, and here in Florida. And have had the pleasure of working with Sam, Mike, and the EB5 AN team for quite some time in EB5 matters, assisting a variety of projects throughout their regional center footprint and others. And we also have the great pleasure of working with families throughout the world in the EB5 process for themselves. And that's actually a very rewarding part of my practice, and where my greater value add is really focused on helping analyze the various strategies for source of funds compliance. Sam, I will note that on your map, I didn't see that you have had investors from Chile participate through your program. So we're going to work hard at changing that, as that is also a viable market.
Yeah, great. I was actually in Chile last year. Beautiful place. All right, now we're going to do a quick overview of source of funds and EB5 context. And once that's over, then we'll let Julian jump in and talk a little bit more about some of the specifics that investors want to be aware of as they consider making an EB5 investment in a project. So contextually, from a high level, source of funds is the process of documenting how an EB5 investor obtained the 900,000 or 1.8 million that's going into the EB5 investment. As part of the EB5 program requirements per USCIS, the investor must invest their own money. They must show that they're the legal owner of the capital that's being invested, and they must show the path of funds to show how they obtained that capital that's going into the EB5 investment. So essentially it's accounting and tracing not only where the money is from, but how did you obtain it and from what source, and how is it effectively your money that's going into the EB5 investment. And so when you actually go to file the EB5 application, and this is kind of the second bottom part of this slide, there's two required components that go into the initial filing, which is called the I-526 petition. So part one of that petition is all the project documents explaining how the project meets EB5 rules. So let's say you were investing in a condominium project, that's going to be the business plan, economic study, private placement memorandum, loan agreement, all the documents that explain how the project creates 10 jobs, the minimum number of jobs required for an EB5 investment per investor, and also how the money is going to meet EB5 rules and create those jobs and remain invested in the project. Then the second part of that filing is what we're talking about today, which is the source of funds documentation. So those are the documents that show the government that this investor from Chile or Mexico or any other country, that the funds that are coming in are legal funds, that they were earned lawfully, meaning no drugs, no, weapons selling, nothing illegal. And those funds belong to the person who's making the investment. And so that's going to be the focus of today's presentation, is covering that half of the application of how do we deal with proving where the money is from. A lot of times foreign countries don't have, the most accurate and detailed historical records. And so, how do we navigate that, potential disparity or lack of records, and make sure that the application is assembled in a way that the US government is going to approve that investor when they come up for review.
So in summary, as long as an investor you choose a well-structured project that's either already approved by the government or will be approved, the key focus that USCIS is going to spend their time on is on your personal source of funds. Most reputable regional centers will structure their projects that can be approved. So almost all of the denials that we see, it's based on source of funds, which is why it's such a critical piece of the application.
Yep, and that's another thing to really highlight, is that the part 1 of this 526 petition, I-526 petition, that part 1 is the same for every investor in the project. So if the condominium project has 30 investors, every one of those 30 people will have an identical part 1 of their application, and only part 2, the source of funds, will obviously be unique for each of those 30 individual investors, and will of course vary dramatically, given that everyone has, capital from different places, different countries, different sources. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears and talk about, just high level, what are some of the common sources of funds and issues that EB5 investors face. So starting out first, obviously ordinary income. So an investor is working as a doctor in a hospital, they earn money, or their spouse earns capital through a normal job. That's ordinary income. And as long as you can show that, you were employed, you earned that income, and you have the records to support that, and any taxes that were required to be paid have been paid, that's going to be ordinary income. Then capital gains, that's going to be money earned by the investor from the sale of an asset with a gain, obviously. So you buy a house for $100,000, you sell it 5 years later for $200,000, and you use that capital to invest in an EB5 project. You would need to show all the documents associated with the purchase originally and sale of that asset. Then gifts, inheritance from family or friends, so money given without any expectation of repayment, or funds that are inherited from family or other members. Then fourth, finally, loans. So loans are allowed. So if you owned a home and you decided to take a mortgage on that home, or you had a business and you took a loan, then as long as you can show that you owned the home and you took the loan, and would show the funds coming from the bank to you as a result of that loan, then that loan capital could be used as part of your source of funds for your EB5 investment. Again, the key here is that the tax treatment on all 4 of these scenarios is going to vary dramatically based on what country those actions took place in. And so the US government understands that not all foreign countries follow the same or similar tax structure as the United States. And so you just have to be able to document and show that whatever taxes that movement of funds was subject to, given the jurisdiction of the transaction, that those taxes were appropriately paid, and all of the correct paperwork, documentation, records, and all that were all properly kept per the rules in the jurisdiction where the transaction occurred. Okay, so now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about ordinary income. So for this, I'm going to let Julian jump in and talk to us a little bit about how ordinary income is typically handled in the context of Mexican investors who are earning income in Mexico, and how, what record keeping challenges and things typically come up in that context.
Thank you, Sam. I will note that fortunately, Mexico is a fairly formal country with respect to corporate governance and the preservance and maintenance of bank records. And so we have the benefit that most of the investors that we work with tend to be highly qualified professionals and have a very good set of detailed bank records. The other thing to note, in particular for Mexican investors, is that due to the very close cultural and geographic ties, it's quite common for Mexicans that are considering the EB-5 program to have US bank accounts. And so that's a potential pro and a con. It's a pro because we have the benefit of US bank records and oftentimes including bank statements in English. The initial challenge is that many would-be investors have the notion that having the money in the bank, particularly in US banks, is the completion of the source of funds analysis. And what I tell them is, actually, that's the start. It's a very good start, but we then need to work backwards to understand how the funds ultimately were earned and how they made it to the US bank account. So as you said, Sam, earlier on, this is really an analysis of forensic accounting to trace the funds. But back to the issue at hand, fortunately, we have the benefit of very formal bank regulations, bank records, and corporate governance documents, quite similar to what you would expect to be able to receive from a US entrepreneur. So corporate minutes, resolutions, and obviously salary payments, whether they be from third-party companies or from a closely held corporate group.
Got it. Thank you, Julian. So how do those items kind of differ in the source of capital gains? Obviously, a lot of investors, have recognized and built wealth, generational wealth over time through real estate. So how does the record keeping and kind of impact real estate that's been held for a long period of time, and what types of documents and issues do you find that are commonly dealt with in that context for EB5 in Mexico?
Sure. So again, if we're dealing with a capital gain from the sale of an asset, you are going to have the underlying transaction documents, and then the bank statements that will correlate and document the source of those funds. If it is a distribution from a company, and I'm not sure if you have dividends in another slide or not, Sam. I'll pause for you to direct me on that, or if we're addressing that here at this slide.
Yeah, so I believe let's talk about dividends here on the capital gains slide as well. I think that's the best place to discuss it.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for that, Mike. So I will tell you that in our experience, the majority of Mexican investors that we deal with are established with closely held business entities, and are usually able to document dividends that have been received over a period of time at great detail. So that actually makes the process for us to be quite simple. Because we can turn to the underlying corporate records, the resolutions authorizing the distributions, and then have a solid understanding of what occurred to generate the capital, and then to understand where the capital has been maintained. Mexico also has a concept called CUFIN, C-U-F-I-N, which I think the analog would be a net tax profits account. And this is something that we often work very closely with colleagues in Mexico to determine whether or not the particular group may have access to this type of retained earnings, so to speak, as that may be advantageous from a tax perspective to the Mexican national when they receive the funds. So unlike some other countries where perhaps we're looking at the sale of real estate or other tangible assets, it's been our experience that when we're dealing with Mexican nationals, we're going to first focus on understanding if they have accumulated dividends from their corporate group, or as in the prior case, if they have the ability to demonstrate a long earnings potential from professional endeavors.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's shift over to talk about gifts and inheritance. So obviously, the U.S. taxation system for gifts and inheritance, varies dramatically from, a lot of other regimes. So in the context of Mexico specifically, what types of records are going to be applicable here, and what types of taxes potentially is the investor going to have been looking at to be responsible for if they're going to be sourcing funds from a gift or from funds that have been inherited?
Right. So one of the big differences in Mexico and other countries is we have to be sensitive to the applicable gift tax that may occur when there is a gift, and so for that purpose, we usually look for other sources of capital because of the potential gift tax. If ultimately the transfer of the funds is going to occur through a gift, then as you note, one of the key components is explaining to the group that the issue of the source of funds is now transferred to the donor. And so that obviously brings a series of potential pitfalls and concerns, because the donor is not seeking the immigration benefit, and there's a tension as to why they should document and demonstrate their private financial records when the benefit is being sought and obtained by a third party. But this is one of the things that we will review with the family. Obviously, gifts can play a part of this. Inheritance as well. The challenge with inheritance is understanding that USCIS is tending to probe the decedent's ability to have obtained the funds or the assets in ways that I think appear to be a little bit more intrusive than has been in the past. I'm noting that many practitioners are seeing request for evidence on 526 petitions where the source is inheritance, that there is a more in-depth analysis of the history of the decedent. And so we're going to try to anticipate as much as possible and provide a set of robust documents that will describe who the decedent was and how they obtained the funds. This is really part of a holistic approach, as you've described, because the reality is when we're dealing with Mexican investors, they tend to be high net worth or ultra high net worth individuals. So I would say that one of the takeaways, in particular with Mexico, is that the wealth of your average EB5 investor, when we compare it to other markets, at least with the client base that we're handling, is probably on a greater scale of wealth. And so that brings opportunities, but also again challenges, because we have to probe further and understand where they may have funds, what other assets they may have that we can ultimately use for the EB5, so that we can develop a very elegant and efficient strategy for them, where at least with our practice, the focal point often is to shorten the time horizon of review. So in that instance, perhaps inheritance is not one of the options that we would look at initially, especially if the decedent passed many years ago, as that can tend to complicate the ultimate analysis for the source of funds.
And Julian, you mentioned request for evidence earlier. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what the procedure is for that, and kind of, how it happens, why it happens, and, how common is it, and, how does the response handle all of that?
Absolutely. It is something that more and more of us are having to deal with as the adjudicators at USCIS either become more sophisticated or more picky. I'm not quite sure which one of those may be the cause, but it does seem that there has been an uptick in request for evidence, and that is the mechanism pursuant to which the adjudicator will submit a series of questions based on the petition and the underlying documents submitted with the petition. And as you've well indicated, Sam, they are most often focused almost exclusively on the source of funds aspect. So we don't tend to receive many RFEs based on the project. They tend to be more focused on the source of funds. And I will tell you from our experience, at least in cases of inheritance, there seems to be a pattern where if we did not anticipate from the very beginning the potential questions associated with the narrative behind where the decedent obtained the assets or the funds and did not provide sufficient documents to address that, we can expect to receive an RFE based on inheritance. So when we're putting together this petition, we always have to pause and analyze the set of documents from the point of view of the adjudicator and remove ourselves from the familiarity we have with the family at this point and with the documents so that we can really be objective. And it is a critical component of being successful in this day and age, is understanding what the particular questions will be. And that obviously will vary from the strategy that has been chosen, whether it is ultimately a gift, inheritance, a dividend distribution, income earned over years, or loans. If I may, Sam, I'd like to just expand a little bit further on loans, because with respect to Mexican nationals, I believe that is one of the more viable strategies. And the reason why is, as I've indicated, most of the groups that we're working with are groups in Mexico that have had funds in the US for quite some time. And so they have long-lasting relationships with US financial institutions. And based on the rather recent developments in EB-5 jurisprudence with respect to the use of loans, there are some interesting strategies that we're now developing, and probably, at least with our client base, those are more likely than not going to be the first option. So we will explore the loan option and exhaust that before we proceed further, as that can be a quite an efficient and elegant strategy for well-capitalized Mexican nationals.
Got it. Okay. All right, so we'll shift gears a little bit now and talk a little more specifically. So when you're in the documentation process, Julian, working with these types of families, what are some of the types of documents that you're going to be looking for, and then what is the process typically for how those documents are going to be obtained and then translated, right? And then one other point I want to just note is that for this investment, you only need to source the $900,000 or the 1.8 million that's going into the project. There's no requirement to show, how, your whole net worth, where, all of your assets are. It has nothing to do with, anything above the EB-5 capital investment that's going into the project. And so as Julian mentioned earlier, it's kind of like putting a puzzle together. In this case, you don't need every single piece, but you need enough pieces so that you hit that minimum amount. So anyway, with that in mind, I'll let Julian take back over here.
Thank you, Sam. And by the way, that's a great point, the last one you've emphasized, and that is to keep in mind that the objective is to source the particular investment amount that is going into the EB5 project. And this is not an exercise to, this is not a personal financial statement. We're not interested in analyzing the entire worth. And that is probably the starting point for our discussion and analysis with the families that we work with. Because with that in mind, I will ask them if they are part of a private company group, does your company have the ability to do an anticipated dividend? Or have you received dividends within the last year that might be of sufficient amount? We'll then ask again, do you have funds in the US? Do you have a strong banking relationship with a US bank or a Mexican bank where you may be able to obtain an unsecured loan? So if the bank is able to provide a set of loan docs where it is clearly a loan not secured by any assets, that is obviously based on our review of the current state of the jurisprudence, compliant with USCIS source of funds requirements. We also obviously will ask for the applicable tax filings, and again, we have the benefit that Mexico is a fairly formal with respect to the preservance of tax records. I always note that tax documents, tax filings are static documents. What I mean by that is that they're not depicting the flow of the capital or necessarily the actual sources of the capital. So they're not always vital. They're an important component of the documentary set, but the bank statements are really going to be more critical with respect to documenting the flow of the funds, which in these RFEs, these requests for evidence, oftentimes if your analysis with respect to the bank statements has not been thorough and you have not presented a set of consistent consecutive monthly bank statements, then you are likely to receive a request for evidence based on the path or the flow of the funds. So we work very closely with the families and their advisors, and that's another key point. This is not an exercise where the US legal team should try to do this themselves. Most of the families we work with in Mexico have sophisticated legal advisors and financial advisors, accountants, and this is really a team effort. And again, from our perspective, this is not necessarily an exercise driven by the immigration lawyers at our firm. I'm a corporate transactional lawyer. The reason for that is I have to understand what are corporate resolutions, what are dividends, how are these documented. I have to be conversant in and familiar with what documents I should expect and what questions I should ask when our client is an entrepreneur or has been an executive who may have received stock options or other remuneration over many years.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Julian. All right, so we touched a little bit on ordinary income already, so we can skip through that. We talked a little bit about capital gains. Julian, maybe can you spend a few minutes talking about a potential sale of a piece of real estate and what types of documents would be required there? Let's say that it was a home in Mexico City, that was purchased 10 years ago, and it's gone up significantly in value. And we're going to have to, show, how the funds were accumulated initially, for that initial purchase, and then, potential mortgage or, sale, closer to the present day.
Yep, thanks, Sam. That's actually a great hypothetical to really illustrate the various components of the source of funds analysis, and it really illustrates how intricate this can be. So we had the pleasure of working with a Mexican national who is an actual U.S. citizen these days. He's a good friend, and he's participated on a few conferences and webinars with me. And his source, the source of funds for his investment, were derived from real estate transactions in Mexico. So he was a home builder, and we actually had to trace the construction, the development and sale of 5 consecutive single-family residences over about a 7-year period, to find the ultimate source of the funds. And this exercise, I think, is one that really illustrates the requirement to detail, as Sam has indicated, when you sell a property or any asset, you have the obligation of demonstrating how you obtained the funds to acquire that asset. And if those funds were obtained from the sale of a prior asset, we have to go back in time until we ultimately can find the seed money, so to speak. So when it comes to the sale of real estate, and this should be generally understood as any asset, whether it be gold bars, undeveloped land, any tangible assets, it is the obligation of the investor to document what happened, how they were able to earn the funds that they used to acquire the asset in the first place. I will note, since we're on the topic of RFEs, that USCIS has also been asking entrepreneurs that have a closely owned company where they have either received a dividend or a return of capital, how they obtained the seed money to fund that company. And this can oftentimes be somewhat silly, I dare say, for at least countries where you have fixed capital, like Mexico, where you might have invested $5,000 to start the company, and that is going to show in the initial set of the corporate records. So we've seen a few RFEs where they actually ask, well, where did the equivalence of $5,000 come from? So that's just an illustration of the level of detail that you have to have when you're starting this process.
Got it. Thank you, Julian. So I think, I know, Julian, we do have some investors from Mexico joining us today. And so I know, with a lot of these investors, sometimes English isn't their best language, particularly when it comes to more complicated transactional and investment decisions, obviously EB5 being one of those. So maybe now would be a good time to kind of, take 5 or 6 minutes and kind of, quickly summarize how the EB5 source of funds works, and then kind of walk through, these 4 examples or categories of potential sources of funds and how, you would work with a Mexican investor to, to get through those sections, but in Spanish.
Sure, thank you, Sam. I'll do so. Buenas tardes a ustedes que están participando. Nuevamente soy Julián Montero y será un placer poder trabajar con ustedes si tienen un interés en avanzar con una petición EB5. Ya tienen la información para comunicarse con mi equipo. Si tienen interés, y podemos tener una conferencia directa en cualquier momento. El tema claramente es un análisis de entender cómo ustedes han generado el capital que ahora van a invertir en el proyecto de EB5. Y esto realmente tiene 2 aspectos. El primero es entender y documentar las transacciones o los eventos que sucedieron para generar el capital. Y cuando hablamos del capital, estamos hablando del monto de $900.000 o de 1.8 millones, dependiendo el tipo de proyecto en el cual ustedes van a invertir. Como Sam explicó previamente, hay dos aspectos a este análisis. El primero es documentar la naturaleza de las transacciones que generaron el capital. Y segundo, y posiblemente más detallado, es documentar el flujo de este capital. Y esto se entiende como el requisito de documentar dónde se ha preservado el capital desde el momento que se generó. Y esto obviamente van a ser los estados de cuenta. Entonces, uno debe entender que el capital debe estar en una cuenta bancaria a nombre del postulante, del inversor, y de ahí debemos entender cómo ha llegado el capital a esa cuenta del postulante como persona natural. Y esto es donde entramos con nuestro equipo para desarrollar estrategias para identificar soluciones que pueden ser eficientes y elegantes para cumplir con estos requisitos. En la pantalla aquí se están demostrando 4 posibles ejemplos que son bastante comunes. Uno, se puede explicar cómo el profesional que ha tenido la oportunidad tras su carrera profesional de ahorrar capitales en un monto suficiente para hacer la inversión. En estos casos es fundamental entender el tiempo de análisis necesario para acumular este capital. Y obviamente, si es un tiempo muy largo, esto invita a posibles complicaciones en documentar estados de cuenta por un periodo de 5, 6 o 7 años, dado que para tener éxito, esto tiene que estar documentado de una manera consecutiva mensualmente. Pero ese es como un ejemplo, el profesional que ha acumulado capital. Otro podría ser capital que se ha obtenido por la venta de activo o de dividendos, o utilizando posiblemente el CUFIN que tienen en México ustedes. Cuando se trata de la venta de un activo, y el activo puede ser cualquier tipo de activo tangible, como se ha ya explicado, la necesidad es documentar cómo se obtuvo el capital para la compra del activo en su inicio. O sea, no es suficiente documentar que se ha logrado la venta y que hay un capital que es producto de la venta. Hay que documentar cómo se adquirió ese activo de su inicio. Y esto obviamente puede presentar cierta complejidad, especialmente si alguien tiene un activo que se compró hace mucho tiempo y puede ser muy difícil identificar la documentación para la compra de ese activo. El tercer concepto son fondos o activos que se han derivado tras una donación o un proceso de sucesión de herencia. Y estos aspectos también traen sus propias complicaciones. En el aspecto de una donación, se transfiere la obligación de documentar el origen de fondos al donante. Ahora, la persona que está donando los fondos tiene que documentar cómo obtuvo este capital para el beneficio de la persona que está recibiendo los fondos. Similarmente, cuando el que está postulando ha recibido capital o activos de parte de un proceso de herencia, también tenemos que identificar y entender cómo fue que el fallecido obtuvo este capital o activo en su inicio. Y esto puede traer complicaciones, especialmente si el fallecido falleció hace mucho tiempo. Obviamente la documentación se pone más difícil en obtener con los años. Últimamente está el uso de préstamos y yo diría que para los grupos mexicanos con cuales estamos trabajando hoy en día, esto probablemente puede ser lo más interesante porque puede disminuir el nivel de documentación que el postulante tiene que presentar. hubo una decisión federal muy importante en un caso contra UCIS, lo cual ahora está mucho más claro los parámetros en cual podemos desarrollar estrategias utilizando préstamos. Y dado que muchos de las familias con cual trabajamos de México ya tienen capitales en Estados Unidos y tienen relaciones con instituciones financieras en Estados Unidos, la estrategia de usar préstamos, yo diría que es algo que deberíamos explorar y agotar antes de ver otras opciones. Pero, en fin, esto es algo, es un arte, yo diría. Hay que anticipar cómo puede analizar la petición el oficial del Servicio de Migración para realmente tener una petición robusta que puede ser aprobada sin ningún interrogatorio adicional. Y para esto entonces invito que se contacten conmigo para tener pláticas ya privadas y profundas por si ustedes tienen interés. Con eso entonces ya regresamos al inglés. Sam, we're back in English. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you, Julian. I picked up about 80% of that, so that's good. Okay, so we already covered a few of these items, so we'll skip through these, and we'll now shift over and spend a few minutes talking about two different EB-5 projects, and then we'll open it up for questions and cover as many as we can. Oh, actually, before we do that, I do want to point out just two kind of available, kind of helpful resources on our website. The source of funds section, as we talked about, is part of that initial petition. And so we've put together a skeleton outline here of a sample just to give an idea of what types of documents are needed and how those documents end up coming together as part of the I-526 petition. So this is completely a fictional scenario, but it's a good kind of way to give you an idea of what the final product looks like that's going to actually be submitted to the US government. And as part of that, we've compiled a list again of completely fictional documents that a person may need, but it just gives you a flavor of the extent, and as Julian mentioned, this can be a very detailed set of documents and a lot of different interlocking pieces that are all going to need to be correctly labeled, scanned, translated, to tell the story without any holes, so that an adjudicator can immediately approve the petition and not issue one of those requests for evidence because a document is missing or something isn't clear, which you want to avoid.
Perfect. And now we want to shift over and talk about two of the active EB5 projects that are structured. So both of these projects are being developed by the Coulter Group. So the Coulter Group is one of the largest real estate developers in the southeast of the United States with a focus in Florida. And they've actually done many projects next to the Saul office that Julian sits in. So the four key divisions of Coulter are Coulter Urban, which is their high-rise condominium development arm, Coulter Hospitality, where they own and operate hotels, and then Coulter Homes and Coulter Land, where Coulter buys large tracts of land, develops the raw land into home sites, and then builds homes and sells the homes. One of the reasons why we've chosen to partner with Coulter on these deals is the fact that they are an extremely large and well-respected developer. They're reputationally and financially strong. Even through the 2008 recession, they finished every project they started, and they repaid all of their loans in full. Quite often, their deals are internally funded, but when they do bring in equity partners, they're often some of the leading family offices and very high-end investors. Additionally, Coulter's won a lot of awards. They're one of the largest privately held home builders in the United States. And on their hotel side, they've won multiple awards from Hyatt, including their Strategic Partner of the Year. The entire executive team has been around for a long period of time within the company, and they are very focused on doing their developments based on a macro theme of people in the US are getting older, they're moving to places with better weather like Florida with lower taxes. So they're capitalizing on the macro trends within the United States and providing a high-end product for the people that are moving down. So the first project we're going to discuss is an equity EB5 investment. This is in a condominium tower that's being built in St. Petersburg, Florida. The construction is underway, and there's already a senior loan in place with Wells Fargo. On this portion of the project, it's only $10.1 million of EB5, 4% of the total cost, and there's a 6% preferred return to EB5 investors. We believe that the equity structure is pretty unique. Most EB5 deals are debt-based, and we'll actually talk about that on our next one, but this is a very unique offering within the EB5 industry. And the second project, and I also want to caveat this by saying that if you'd like more information on either of these projects, please reach out to us so we can ensure that you're an accredited investor and share the actual details and offering documents. But for the second project, this is the debt portion of the same deal of Saltair St. Petersburg. So now that the equity is all in place and there's an executed loan with Wells Fargo, there's additional capital that's we're going to raise with EB5 debt. The project is fully capitalized, but the EB5 debt does play an important role in reducing the overall capital cost of the project. Construction is underway. There's many different guarantees and security mechanisms put in place on this deal, and we'd be excited to speak with you more about this deal. So please reach out to us individually and we can discuss it with you. And with that, I think we're going to open it up to the questions and we'll go through them and start answering. So one question that we've gotten is, what is the most common source of funds for investors coming from Mexico? So Julian, can you jump back in on that? Based on all of the cases that you've seen, what's the most common structure that's used to show historically where the 500 and now where the 900,000 comes from?
Sure. Thanks for that. Based on our practice, it would clearly be the use of dividends. It seems to me that most of the families that are contemplating EB5 that are coming from Mexico have a closely held business activity. And we are able to work with the families and their financial advisors and their tax advisors to develop efficient strategies using dividends or this concept of CUFIN, which is a particular Mexican concept, which may have some tax advantages for the individual taking the profits from the company in Mexico. So I would say the use of dividends was historically the most active. I will tell you that now, based on the Zhang decision, we are shifting our focus initially for the viability of loans. Again, based on the fact that most of these families have well-established relationships with financial institutions in the US, and we have found that many of them are able to obtain unsecured loans from US financial institutions.
Got it. In terms of the dividends, what types of documents and information, if any, are required to kind of legitimate that, like it is a real, established going concern business that's making the dividend, and it's not just a vehicle, where just, cash was just put in it and, is now being dividended out, in the form of a dividend. How do you kind of address that part of it?
Great question, Sam. So we start from the point of view of any corporate lawyer, and that is the organizational documents, understanding the nature of the business, when was it organized, making sure that it is still validly organized. So all of the relevant corporate resolutions and certificates, registrations, licenses that are necessary to establish the bona fides of the business entity. We'll then turn to the underlying financial aspects of the business, the general balance, the balance sheets. Have there been audited financials prepared on an annual basis by any of, either tier 1 or tier 2 global accounting firms? the tax records of the business. And then to the extent that this is a dividend or a sequence of dividends, we'll look at the corporate resolutions. We'll work with the family's legal advisors to really understand the nature of the corporate resolutions, make sure that the dividends have been duly authorized. If a dividend was authorized in a particular year for the amount indicated in that document, it needs to be corroborated by the bank statements of both the company and the recipient. So then the other component is really the analysis of the flow of the funds, and this is where we get into the meat of it. So we'll turn to the bank statements of the company for the period of time relevant for the distribution, whether it be a bonus or a dividend, to make sure that those documents are internally consistent, and that is clear. One of the many pitfalls I've seen when people come to our office with petitions prepared by other groups is you have internally inconsistent documents. It might have said that the dividend was for 10x and it's for 8.5x, and it was never explained that there was a tax that occurred, and that's why it's for a lesser amount. So you really have to be quite conversant with what actually happened, and then trace the funds so that the recipient received the amounts that are documented. So it's fairly thorough, but again, it's really a pleasure to work with groups from Mexico because they will have these documents. We're able to read them in their native language without the complication of a translation before we're able to work with the families. And then obviously we identify the documents that have to be translated. We use third-party translators. And the benefit of our team is then we're also able to vet the translation, because I've seen, unfortunately, oftentimes when people do not review the US language translation and compare it with the source document, and there are inconsistencies. And I have found that USCIS is beginning to pick up on that. So again, we're dealing with some fairly sophisticated adjudicators that are reviewing this, in my opinion, in the way that they ought to be reviewed.
And so on the RFP context, what are some of the most common types of RFPs that you see investors from Mexico being faced with answering?
Sure. Well, I will. I've got to be honest with you. We're fairly tight with our process, but the RFPs so generally will be, and I think this can be this is applicable to Mexican investors and non-Mexican investors equally. The bank statements, right? So flow of the funds, tracing of the funds, understanding where the funds have been, that's critical. Inheritance is I think becoming more problematic if you are unable to really understand how the decedent obtained the asset or the funds and provide some, I'd say, fairly robust documentation associated with how these funds were earned. I think most folks that are using inheritance are seeing some probing along those lines. But I would tell you that Mexico benefits from not having currency restrictions or any other challenges that you have from many countries where you can't convert the currency, or even if you can, you can't do direct transfers from Mexico to the US. So it is really one of the more transparent markets to work with respect to EB-5 source of funds analysis.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I think that's all we'll have time to cover today. Julian, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for sharing all of your experience and doing that bit of the presentation in Spanish. I think that was really helpful for us. And again, all of the contact information for both Julian and for our team is listed on the screen. And if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint slides, please reach out to us, info@eb5en.com. And if you would like to share or rewatch this webinar, look for it on our YouTube channel in the next few days. And if there are any questions specifically about source of funds, please reach out to Julian. And any questions about either the two EB5 projects that we covered today, please reach out to us at EB5 Affiliate Network. And so with that, we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you again, Julian.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.